Thanks. Okay, so our topic today is blood vessels. And probably the first thing to note about blood vessels is that they are built in layers. Okay, the blood vessels throughout your body, arteries, veins, capillaries, they're built from layers of tissue. And in the picture that you see here, the microscopic view of a couple of blood vessels in the body, you see an artery labeled with the A and a vein, and you can see that there are many, many layers of tissue forming the structure of the artery and the vein. You notice some differences, though, about the artery and the vein. The artery here stands as a big wide open tube. The vein over here is kind of collapsed. It's kind of squished. And of course, that's one of the most important things to note about arteries and veins. Arteries have fairly thick walls, and so they stand up as a solid tube. They tend to have a lot more strength. Veins are more flabby. They're more bag-like. They don't have as many layers to them, and so it's easy for them to be squeezed. They don't stand up with the same kind of structure that an artery would. Now you'd think, well, then an artery is better than a vein. Well, not necessarily. Each one of them has a structure that is appropriate for what they're doing and how they're going to work. The picture that you see over here on the other side is the picture from your textbook that shows all the potential layers. All the potential layers in a blood vessel. Big blood vessels are going to have many, many layers. Small blood vessels are going to have very few layers. If you were to follow a blood vessel from the heart out to its destination, that blood vessel would get smaller and smaller and smaller. You typically see branches branching off of it, going to different locations, but it gets smaller and smaller, and as it did, it would have less and less and less layers. Some of the layers would begin to melt away. They'd become thinner and thinner, and then they disappear, and then other layers would become thinner and thinner and then disappear. So the farther out you go, the smaller and the less number of layers. Okay? So let's look at then the layers, and we're going to describe three major layers here in the potential blood vessel. And I keep saying that because, again, the big blood vessels are going to have many layers, the smaller blood vessels fewer. Each layer is going to be called a tunic. A tunic is an ancient word for a piece of clothing. This is kind of like dressing up. If you're going to go to someplace cold, but it might be warm in the middle of the day, you might not just take one big coat so you're either hot or cold. You might dress in layers of clothing so that you could take off as many layers as you need to keep you comfortable. And each layer, if you use the older word, would be sort of like a tunic, sort of a layer of clothing. There are three major layers here then. The tunica externa, is the outermost layer of a blood vessel. We typically only find this in the larger blood vessels in the body. The layer, which is comprised of several tissues, the layer in the middle is tunica media, and then the layer on the inside, the lining of the blood vessel is a good way to describe this, is the tunica interna. If you study this from your textbook, you'll see a couple of different words here. You'll see tunica adventitia, tunica media, and tunica intima. I'm going to use these. I think these are a little easier to use. Some textbooks use one, some use the other. This is one of those places where I'd rather use these than the ones in your textbook. So use these terms for me. Interna, internal, externa, external. Should be pretty easy to outside the middle and the inside. Okay, so three major sort of layers. Now, within these layers, there are various tissues, and I've described these in the handout, but let's go through them here. The tissues that are involved in each layer. In the tunica externa, we would find dense collagenous connective tissue. And so the larger blood vessels are going to have a nice big layer of this dense connective tissue. I always like to stop at this point and say, think of how many times we've talked about dense connective tissue this semester. Over and over and over again. Any place the body is going to build something strong but flexible, like a tendon from a muscle or a ligament from a joint. The rectus sheath over the rectus abdominis or the thoracolumbar fascia in the back. Anywhere you need to reinforce the human body, this is what the body uses. It uses its collagen tissues, the dense tissues, to do that. So it would be natural here to put a layer of this around the outside to make it strong. So the tunica externa is basically that. Tunica media is made up of two different types of tissue. There is smooth muscle in this tunica media, and there's also a dense elastic connective tissue. An elastic connective tissue that's going to allow, of course, the blood vessel to expand and recoil. So there's two types of tissue typically found in the tunica media. And when you think about what this is going to do, smooth muscle is obviously something that can contract, so it could change the diameter of the blood vessel, couldn't it? That makes sense? The brain could use this smooth muscle to make the blood vessel smaller or the blood vessel bigger. The elastic tissue is going to be more of a passive thing where it just gives elasticity so that the blood vessel can swell and recoil and swell and stretch and then come back to where it was. The tunica interna here is then what we want to think of as just the lining of the blood vessel. We call that lining the endothelium. From that name, you ought to be able to figure, oh, this is an epithelial tissue, right? And that's pretty obvious. Anything that's on the surface of something, your body uses an epithelial tissue, and the inside of the tube is going to have a lining. This is slick smooth, so we aren't going to have any blood clotting on the inside of this, at least hopefully. The tunica interna actually does have a couple of other layers. All of the layers you see from here to here to here, all of these, sometimes the very large ones have an extra little bit of smooth muscle, an extra little bit of elastic here. But I'm not going to, that just kind of complicates things. So we're going to try and keep this simple by saying the outside is the tough one, the inside is the active one, right? Can change things about the blood vessel. And the inside, again, is just sort of passive. It's the lining of the blood vessel. Now, of all of these layers, the one layer that is always present in every single blood vessel, okay, is the endothelium. The endothelium is present in every blood vessel. If you melt away, if the blood vessel gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, all the other layers melt away, you're still going to have one layer left. When you get to the capillaries, remember from last week, we talked about the microscopic little blood vessels that connect from the arteries to the veins or the capillaries. When you get to a capillary, the only thing that's left are the cells of the endothelium. And you can sort of compare here. Here's a much larger blood vessel. You can see how many cells it takes to line the inside. When you get down to this level, this being so small, it's just one or two cells, are all that's needed to make this tube. So that's the one layer that's always there. The other layers are needed to get blood where it needs to be. But the walls here are going to be so thin, so that all the exchanges can take place. Remember, we said all the action in the human body is in the capillaries. Capillaries are where all of the exchanges occur. These blood vessels with many, many layers to them, you can't get oxygen and nutrients and waste products. You can't get them through a blood vessel with many, many layers in it. Okay, so if we look then again, let's just detail these layers. The dense collagenous tissue creates the tunica externa, makes the blood vessel tough. One of the other things that you will see here is the vasa vasorum. Okay, the vasa vasorum is literally, the word means the blood vessels of the blood vessels. So think about that. Some blood vessels are so thick that they have their own blood vessels. Okay? The smooth muscle here in the tunica media is deep inside the layers of the blood vessel. Those muscle cells need to survive. They do not just soak blood out of the tube here. That's not going to occur. So how do these get oxygen? How do these smooth muscle cells get nutrients? Well, the larger blood vessels have their own blood vessels. Amazing concept. And we call them the vasa vasorum. So you can see them here in the picture, coming down through the tunica externa and reaching into the tunica media. Now, the blood vessels that need a tunica externa, that need this dense connective tissue, are typically the ones that are passing through the major parts, the major spaces in the body. Think about what you've seen when you've seen blood vessels in the cat. These are blood vessels that are in spaces in the body. Here's a cross section of a thigh, and you can see all the muscles. And you can see here and there blood vessels that are in the loose connective tissues. And when we dissected the cat and you had the thigh there, all you had to do was sort of wipe away the loose connective tissue, and the blood vessel was separate. It was a separate entity. And those types of blood vessels are going to need the dense connective tissue around the outside because they're their own structure and they need to be tough. Basically all the blood vessels that you would see in a picture like this, if you're looking at the human body and looking at all the major blood vessels, these all need a tunica externa on them because they're separate within the body. Now, at some point, the branches of the blood vessels are going to pass into an organ. Like I've got a picture here of the liver, and you can see all these blood vessels. The liver is a solid organ, right? And if you imagine these blood vessels passing through it, you could probably see how the structure or the cellular tissue of the liver is going to support these blood vessels. They're not separate, they're within the organ, and the tissues of the organ are going to provide support for the blood vessel. So the blood vessel doesn't need a lot of extra strength. We don't see the tunica externa typically on the blood vessels as they pass into an organ. This could be the liver, this could be the kidney, this could be your lungs, whatever organ it might be. Okay, vessels in tissues are going to be supported by the tissues. Okay, they need less of their own structure. The ones passing through the spaces in the body need more. Okay? So that's the tunica externa. When we talk about the tunica media, we're talking about smooth muscle and this dense, elastic connective tissue. Typically in the tunica media, we're going to see more of one or more of the other. There's both present, but in some blood vessels, there's more of one, and in others, there's more of another. Like in this one here, I can see there's a lot more smooth muscle in this illustration than there is elastic in the tunica media. The tunica media is this. You can see tunica externa there, tunica media to here, and tunica interna here. And you'll see from the pictures. There's some blood vessels where the elastic tissue is more important to what the blood vessel is doing. There are other places where smooth muscle isn't more important to what the blood vessel is doing. Okay? Smooth muscle controls the diameter, and so it can control blood flow. The elastic tissue is going to give a certain amount of pressure, right? If you've got something that squeezes with its elasticity, then you've got a layer that's going to help with pressure within the system. Now, when we're talking about the layers, and especially the layers here in the tunica media, there are problems that can come about if the layers have weaknesses in them. And maybe you've heard of this medical condition before, an aneurysm. How many of you have heard of an aneurysm before? Okay, did you know what it was? Okay, it's a tear or a weakness in some of the layers, and these are only in arteries. Okay, it's a tear or a weakness where the blood pressure then can press out through the layers, and typically what you see is a bulging of the blood vessel then. And blood is moving through some sort of little weakness or some little tear, and it's getting through some of the layers, and it's pushing onto the other layers. Like typically here, the blood is coming through the tunica media, and all that's holding this then is the connective tissue of the tunica externa. And you can see there can be different types of aneurysms. You can have just a bubble sort of thing. You can have a swelling. If one of these breaks, then you're in big trouble. High blood pressure can lead to this condition, right? Because the more pressure there is, the more that pressure may find a weakness in the blood vessel and begin to press on that, and continuous pressure against that weakness can tear it open and press it out against the tunica externa. And then if it pops, you can be bleeding internally. If this is in a tight space, like where you've just got tissues all bundled together, you might get a swelling, but the fact that there's lots of tissue around it may keep it from bleeding too much. If it happens in, like you'd see here, in the abdominal cavity, well, man, you could just bleed right into that cavity space. You could bleed out a lot of blood. So that aneurysm relates directly to the layering and weaknesses in the layering of a blood vessel. Okay? Now we want to emphasize that arteries are high pressure hoses. Okay, arteries are the blood vessels that are coming out of the heart. Arteries are the blood vessels that the heart is pumping directly into. It's the pressure of the heart that keeps that blood flowing, but it's also that pressure that's against the layers, against the walls. The thicker walls, arteries are always thicker because they have those layers to help withstand the pressure. If you have a patient who's bleeding, you'll know if they're bleeding from an artery or a vein. If you bleed from an artery, the blood oozes because it's not under high pressure. If somebody cuts an artery, you're going to have blood that's squirting, that is shooting. Very dangerous condition because you cut an artery and you can bleed out very quickly. Luckily, the arteries will, if you cut an artery, usually the cells around there will contract and cinch and try and slow down the amount of blood. But if it's a fairly large artery, you can be in trouble. The body is built to hide its arteries. You are built with most of your arteries hidden. The few places that you can find an artery on the surface or near the surface of the human body, the arteries are hidden by the way the body is structured. Like, remember when we were dissecting here in the cat, we found the brachial artery here, right? Fairly near the surface. But when I'm in a normal body position, where is that? It's hidden under my armpit, sort of, isn't it? It's hidden between here and here. I'm not likely to get it cut or damaged or injured, right? The femoral artery, when we saw that, just like up here, the inside of your thigh, the femoral artery is fairly superficial. Not completely, but pretty much. But when I'm standing right, those femoral arteries are facing into each other in the midst of my thighs, and the chance of damaging that is not very great. So most of the arteries are hidden deeper within the body so that they can't accidentally get damaged. It's really this sort of structure, these many, many layers, that define the difference between an artery and a vein. That's why we always identify arteries as leading away from the body or from the heart, and veins leading back to the heart, because each has its own structure. All arteries have similar structures, all veins do, but they have different pressures that they have to deal with. So we never define an artery or vein as carrying oxygenated or deoxygenated blood, and you know that by now. We've already spoken about that. So let's look at the various types of arteries. There are 3 types of arteries that you should know. 3 types. The first type that you see here is called an elastic artery. These are the ones closest to the heart. And if you look at the diagram here, when you look at the tunica media, is there more elastic or more muscle here? Right? Well, obviously, a lot more elastic connective tissue than there is smooth muscle. When the blood is leading away from the heart, we don't need to open or close blood vessels. Okay? We just want all of that blood to flow out through the tubes to the various tissues. When they get out into the tissues, then we can make decisions about whether a lot of blood should go into this tissue or a lot of blood should go into that tissue. What we do need is a nice heavy layer of elastic connective tissue. And I think you can picture this. Picture the heart and picture the aorta. Can you picture the aorta with its big aortic arch and descending? You've seen it in the cat. You've seen it in pictures. When the heart squeezes and forces blood into the aorta is not empty, is it? The aorta is already full of blood. I'm pushing more blood into the aorta to raise the pressure in the system, like pumping more air in a tire. What happens to that aorta that's already full of blood when I push more blood into it? What does it do? What does it need to do? It's going to expand, isn't it? It's already full of blood. If I push more blood into it, I want it to be able to go, right, and expand with that surge of blood. And then what's going to happen? Okay? The elasticity, that thick elastic layer then, is going to make the blood vessel go and come back, right? It's going to squeeze it. Not squeezing it like using muscle. It's a passive squeezing, isn't it? If you stretch something that's elastic, it just comes back, doesn't it? So it doesn't take any extra work to put that elastic pressure on it. All you have to do is push the blood into it, make it expand, and then the elasticity will squeeze back on it. Now, when you squeeze back on it, where does all that blood go that you've just squeezed with the elastic? It's going to go forward, isn't it? And so the next part of the artery is going to bulge and then recoil. And then that squeezes that drop of blood forward. And so you get this squeezing, this bulging and recoiling elastic action all the way down the blood vessel. And this is what you're sensing if you take somebody's pulse. You ever taken somebody's pulse? Right? Typically, if you're at the doctor's office, you take it right here at the radial artery, right near the wrist. You put your fingers there, and what do you feel? You're feeling the artery going boom, boom, boom. And those bumps are radiating all the way down the artery. You know, brachiocephalic here, subclavian, axillary, brachial, into the radial. And all of the arteries from here out are going bump, bump. They're bulging and recoiling and bulging. And that's what you're feeling. And that's helping to pump the blood. All the heart has to do is get it started, and then the elasticity takes over. You're in big trouble if your arteries cease to be elastic. Arteriosclerosis is another condition. In fact, you should add that to your pink list. I forgot to write that in. That's one of the ones that's missing. I've got a whole list of them there at the bottom right-hand side. Write in arteriosclerosis there. Hardening of the arteries. If your arteries become stiff, inelastic, then they don't pump the blood anymore. They don't help the heart. If the heart is pumping into a solid tube, then every bit of effort to keep the blood moving has to come from the heart. Right? The heart doesn't keep going. The heart is aided by the elasticity of the arteries. Okay? And if the elastic nature of the artery is gone, then the heart has to do all the work. To get the blood out to your hand, the heart has to provide extra pressure. That means it works harder. That means it's going to wear out sooner. Okay? So, the elasticity of the large arteries, and these are the arteries you can see that lead all the way out to tissues. Now, once those arteries begin to pass into the tissues, then we see a change in the artery. And the artery becomes more muscular. The tunica media has more smooth muscle in it now and less elastic tissue. Okay? Has more smooth muscle and less elastic tissue, and so we call it a muscular artery. And then as the muscular arteries are passing through the tissues and get smaller and smaller and smaller, they're finally going to become the smallest little arteries that are called arterioles. An arteriole is the smallest thing that we would still call an artery. When you look at it, you can see it's not much more than a capillary. There can be a few smooth muscle cells. So there's technically an extra small bit of extra layer here. Little bit of tunica media. Any smooth muscle cells here would have to be part of the tunica media. So we can still call it an artery type blood vessel, but these are getting very small. We're almost to the capillaries when we get to the arterioles. Okay, so we spoke of how elastic arteries maintain blood pressure, and that's critical to what they do. We spoke of arteriosclerosis. When we get to muscular arteries, we noticed that the smooth muscle is thicker here. If you look at the picture here, what you're seeing, anybody recognize where this might be? What do you think this is? Yeah, this is the kidneys, okay? These are the two kidneys, right and left. Here's the inferior vena cava. This was the last thing sort of we did when we were dissecting the cat last week. Here's the abdominal aorta behind it. These would all be elastic arteries here. The aorta and the renal artery, the renal vein. Renal artery here is an elastic artery. As soon as you go into the kidney, you can see that the blood vessels fill the kidney, don't they? Every cell in the kidney needs to have a blood vessel next to it. As you go into the kidney, you don't need as much support. The elasticity isn't as important, but the muscularity of the artery is important. And that's so that we can control the amount of blood flow into the kidney or into any other organ. The amount of energy that a tissue needs is related to how much work it needs to do. All right? If a tissue is very active, it needs a lot of oxygen, so it's going to need a greater blood flow. If a tissue is at rest, it's going to need less blood flow. Think of your digestion, for instance. You know, after you've had a big meal, your digestive system goes into high gear and really works on that. But if it's been hours since you've eaten, the digestive system isn't very active. It slows down. It doesn't need as much oxygen to run at low gear as it does at high gear. And so there is a need to be able to open and close arteries within the human body to provide more oxygenated blood or less oxygenated blood at times of high activity or low activity. Okay? Now, there's not enough blood in your human body to fill all the arteries. If every artery was wide open and you had blood in all of the arteries, then there wouldn't be any way to close one down or open one up. If you closed one down, where would that blood go? If every artery was totally filled, then there would be no way to say, well, more blood over here or less blood over there. Instead, there's a smaller amount of blood that would fill all of the arteries if they were all wide open. And so what the body does is it opens arteries in places where that area is more active, and it closes down other blood vessels where things are less active. The brain can do this. It can open up and close down various areas. Now, you don't think about this, but it happens behind the scenes. If you're going to provide more blood to one area in the human body, that means you are going to have to subtract blood from some other area in the human body. There isn't enough blood for all, and you can't then manage the blood supply. The brain can't do that. Now, this has some implications on how active your body is and how active certain parts of your body are. Okay? When you think about this idea of getting blood to one place or the other, the body can sometimes get into trouble if you've got two competing systems that want blood. And you'll recognize some of these. If you think of, here's several of the very large areas that might need blood. Your skin is the largest organ in your human body. And you have an active blood supply to your skin. It helps radiate out heat from your body. But there's just a lot of skin. All of the muscles in your body, there's a huge amount of muscular tissue in your body. Like 60% of the tissue in your human body is muscle. Most of that's skeletal muscle. All of the organs and all of the activity of the digestive system is a very, very large sort of pool-like area that could use a lot of blood or very little blood, depending upon what you're doing. So here's a typical place where you'd see a problem. You know, you've got to think about this when you're thinking about patients. How active is what part of their body? And if they seem to be having trouble, is it because they're not distributing blood well? Here's a good one. Let's say we go to lunch today and we have a nice big lunch. You know, we just really pork out. And then maybe 30 minutes later we think, oh, you know what? I haven't been exercising much lately. I'm going to go, put on my stuff, and I'm going to go down to the track, and I'm going to run as fast as I can around the track for 2 or 3 miles. Well, if I'm trying to do that with a great big meal here in my belly, I'm going to start feeling pretty bad. I'm going to start going, and there's something wrong with my human body. Well, the basic way to describe that is the fact that I've put all this food in my digestive system. The digestive system needs enough oxygenated blood to make its smooth muscle work. And yet at the same time, I'm telling my skeletal muscles to do their work, and they're demanding oxygenated blood. And the reality is, if I push this hard enough, there isn't enough oxygenated blood to meet both needs. These two areas are too large an area to be able to supply blood to all of those. I would have to take blood away from the brain or something else, and that's not good. Which one of these two is going to win? Okay? Exercising is going to win because I can use my will, right? I can't tell my digestive system what to do. It just does what it's supposed to do. But I can push and push and push my muscles if I want. And so the skeletal muscles get all of this blood. The digestive system doesn't get enough oxygenated blood to meet its needs. And so I start feeling very uncomfortable, don't I? The food is down there, but it's just kind of sitting there like a lump. And it's not getting acted on, it's not getting squeezed, it's not getting processed. And so the digestive system starts rebelling. And at some point, if you push it hard enough, it might just say, hey, I've had enough of this. Let's get this food out of here, and it's going to cause you to regurgitate, right? And you're going to vomit that food back out. Basically, you don't have enough resource to do the digestion that you need to. So we get into trouble when we try and have two major competing activities that are demanding blood. There isn't enough blood to go around in the body. Exercising in hot weather would be another good example of this, right? I'm working my muscles. The muscles are generating heat, but the air outside is warm. So the way my body deals with that is to run a lot of blood to the skin, but this is the largest organ in my human body. And I'm trying to radiate out the heat from that. But if I can't, again, if I'm demanding, the muscles are voluntary, the skin flow is involuntary. If I don't get enough blood going to the skin, if I don't radiate off enough heat, my core temperature can start going up to dangerous places. There are people that die from overheating because they're exercising in very warm weather. There isn't enough blood to go around. Now, there's also a medical condition related to this. You can actually, because there isn't enough blood to fill all the arteries, if all the arteries were in your body were to open at once, if all the smooth muscle in there were to relax at the same time, there wouldn't be enough blood to fill all of the arteries. And of course, if you're standing up, all of that blood, gravity would begin to just take all of that blood down to fill the lower arteries, subtracting it from the brain, and you would probably pass out. We have a name for that condition. We say somebody goes into, right? They go into shock. Okay, have you heard of somebody going into shock? Right? It's no mystery now. It's all of the smooth muscle in the arteries that are maintaining some tension. They all release at the same time. Blood flows down because there's no longer any pressure keeping it up toward the brain. Blood is taken down by gravity, right? And within about 10 seconds, if the brain is without blood, oxygenated blood for about 10 seconds, it will just pass out. And you fall to the floor. Now, when you're on the floor, it's a little easier to get blood pressure going again because you're not trying to pump it against gravity. And so typically you can get blood going back to the brain. But when somebody goes into shock, it's just they release. You've got to have a certain amount of tension in all of the arteries to maintain blood pressure. And blood pressure falls if all the arteries relax at the same time. We say the body goes into shock. You don't lose any blood, you just lose the pressure because you don't have any squeezing by the arteries. Blood pressure is an interesting thing if you think about it. I've got a system of arteries and I'm pumping blood into them. Every squeeze of the heart raises the pressure. But I've also got exits from the arteries. Blood goes out into the capillaries and then onto the veins. So blood is always flowing out. If I want a certain pressure in the system, the amount I'm pushing in needs to equal the amount I'm letting out. If I open, think of this, if I've got this system of pressure, if I open the outlet a little bit more, what will happen to the pressure in the system? You following me? I'm pushing pressure into the system, got all these tubes, but it's flowing out, right? If I let more blood out, if I open up the arteries a little bit, if I let more out, what will happen to the pressure in the system? It'll reduce, right? It'll fall. If I tighten up the arteries, if I make them a little smaller, what will happen to the pressure in the system? It'll increase, won't it? There are people that have what we call hypertension or high blood pressure. Most of the medications today relax the arteries to let a little bit more pressure out. Okay? The pressure in the system is based on two things. How much blood am I pumping into the system, and how much blood is getting out of the system? And if you put more blood in, you're going to raise the pressure, or if you let less out, you're going to raise the pressure. And so we use the artery, the muscular arteries in the human body to try and decrease blood pressure in people that naturally have high blood pressure. High blood pressure is tough because it puts more work on the heart. And the heart is more likely to become damaged when you've got all of that excess pressure in the system. So muscular arteries are very, very important to this whole pressure type system. We've got the heart putting blood into the system. We've got elastic arteries helping the heart. And then we've got muscular arteries controlling the output of the blood. Now, the muscular arteries then lead to arterioles. Arterioles are often called capillary gates. These are the little blood vessels leading into the capillaries. And they still are called arteries because they will have some smooth muscle cells associated with them. And those muscle cells, if they squeeze, will pinch the arteriole and make it a little smaller, make it a little bigger. So likewise, if the tissues that these capillaries are feeding are very active, they're going to receive more oxygenated blood. If they're less active, they're going to receive less oxygenated blood. And that control is going to come by way of these arterioles. Now it's interesting to look at the difference in the control. Muscular arteries are controlled by nerves coming from the brain, and the involuntary parts of your brain are controlling things like digestion and heart rate and blood pressure, those kinds of things. The brain is directly controlling that. Here in the tissues, it's a passive control. It's a passive control. The more the tissues work, the more blood they need, the more they will influence the arterioles to give them more blood. And it's kind of a simple process, but you can see how this would work. Smooth muscle cells here, you can see that they could pinch the blood vessel, right? They're going to contract if they have more oxygen. If they have less oxygen, they're going to relax. More oxygen, they contract. Less oxygen, they relax. They start starving for oxygen, and they can't contract so well, so they release. So more oxygen, they close the blood vessel. Less oxygen, they open the blood vessel. So if the tissue is very active, what's happening to the oxygen levels here? The tissues are taking it up, they're using it up, and so the oxygen level falls, right? And so what happens to the smooth muscle? It relaxes, right? Because it doesn't have so much oxygen because the tissues are using up all the oxygen. So it relaxes, bringing more oxygenated blood to a very active tissue. That makes sense? If the tissue then gets less active, if it relaxes, if it begins to rest, then it's not using up much oxygen. There's much more oxygen available for these smooth muscle cells, and so they close, they tighten a little bit more, bringing less oxygenated blood in, but that's okay because the tissue is resting. It doesn't need so much oxygen. So the oxygen use of the tissues themselves influences the contraction and the relaxation of the smooth muscle cells here. And so there's this natural flow of oxygenated blood into busy tissues and a smaller flow of blood into tissues that are not so active. So I get the right amount of oxygenated blood to the tissues based on their activities. And it's a simple oxygen feedback to those smooth muscle cells. So we call arterioles capillary gates because they regulate the amount of oxygenated blood flowing through the capillaries to the tissues. Good with that? Okay, now from there, we're now into the capillaries. Okay, we're now into the capillaries. Capillaries are just, just a couple of cells are all that are going to be needed to make a tube as small as a capillary. Now you see here two different kinds of capillaries, and in your handout there are three listed there, aren't they? There's three listed. Now notice that these capillaries are not sequential. You know what I mean by that? The arteries were sequential, weren't they? Blood flows into the elastic arteries first. From there it flows out to the muscular arteries. From there it flows out to the arterioles. So we were going from bigger to medium to small tubes. Blood always follows that pathway to get out to the capillaries. But some tissues have one type of capillary in them. Other tissues have other kinds of capillaries. So the three types of capillaries here are not sequential. They're mostly based on the thickness of the walls here. Okay, here is a capillary with a fairly thick cytoplasmic layer to it. Okay? Here is a capillary with very thin walls. In fact, the walls are so thin that in certain places there are actually little holes, little gaps. In this kind of a capillary, the plasma of the blood can actually literally just flow out. The walls are porous, and these capillaries, the plasma flows out and bathes the tissues around about it. Remember, the plasma is what is carrying most of the delivered materials. Remember, the nutrients, all of these things are dissolved in the plasma. And so when the plasma flows out, it feeds and bathes all of the tissues in the body. And all the tissues are getting fresh plasma, a fresh bath continually. Okay? In this type of a capillary, those nutrients, those fluids, all of that will come out of this capillary, but it must pass through the capillary cells themselves. The cells here are going to help regulate. So this is a regulating type capillary that may let certain things out and prevent other things in the plasma from not getting out into the environment. This can control the fluid environment around about it, where in this kind of capillary, the tissues are going to have the same chemical makeup as the plasma is. So I've got leaking capillaries, and I've got what are called continuous capillaries. So some capillaries allow leakage. Plasma flows out. These are called fenestrated capillaries. Fenestrated capillaries, their walls are built so that there are holes in them and plasma can leak directly out. In those places, the chemical makeup of the tissues is the same chemical makeup as the cells, as the plasma of the blood. There are some capillaries with great big holes in them. These are called sinusoidal capillaries. These leak, but they leak big time. See how big the holes are here? This is like the wall of the capillary. This is places where you need to process the plasma. So you're going to have some great big openings to let a lot of plasma through into spaces where it can be processed. Best example of finding sinusoidal capillaries is in the kidney. Kidney, you want to get the waste products out of the plasma, so you get a lot of plasma into the spaces where you can process it in the kidney. So both fenestrated and sinusoidal are leakage. The sinusoidal ones just have large leakage spaces, whereas the fenestrated are smaller. The ones that are probably most interesting, though, are the continuous capillaries, where the boundary between one cell and another is very tight, and the only way for plasma to get through here is for it to come through the capillary itself, come through the walls. The capillary cell has to facilitate that, has to help that happen. You can see here in this picture, here's a continuous capillary of the central nervous system. This is one of the places where you really think about what capillaries do and how interesting they are. There's something in the human body called the blood-brain barrier. Has anybody ever heard of that before? The blood-brain barrier? You're looking basically at the blood-brain barrier here. Now there's another set of cells from the brain that helps make a barrier, but there's a chemical barrier. Your brain and your spinal cord actually live in a separate space in your human body. It's both separated physically because there are membranes and things that separate the brain from the rest of the body. But there's also a chemical separation right here. Capillaries are delivering everything that they need, but nerve cells are so particular about their chemical environment. They need such a precise constitution of nutrients and ions and other kinds of chemical raw materials and things. They need such a precise sort of chemical makeup that they live in a separate place. There's a separate fluid. It comes from the plasma, but it has a special constitution. And it's because all of that fluid is, in a sense, sort of filtered through these continuous capillaries. They control what can get through and what can't. And for ages and ages, it was very, very, very difficult to get anything into the brain because of this blood-brain barrier. Our treatment of mental illness today is very, very different from what it was, say, before World War II. You know, if you went back 60, 70 years from today, you would see people that had mental illnesses treated very, very differently. Today, a lot of people that might have some mental illness are walking around living normal lives because they're taking certain kinds of drugs that help stabilize the chemical activity in their brain. And we have ways to do that. But we didn't 60 or 70 years ago. The scientific revolution from World War II and into the 60s really got the whole study of chemistry and our ability to do chemical things, our understanding of the chemistry of the human body, changed our ability to deal with mental illness. Do you know how how did we treat most mental illness before that time, before that World War II time? What? Put them in, okay. Not so much in jail, but we isolated them, didn't we? Almost every little community in the United States had a little mental hospital in it. You know, every town would have one of these. And, you know, crazy Aunt Janice or, you know, whoever it was, you know, she would just disrupt life too much here, and we'd take her, and we could visit her whenever we wanted to because she was right here in town. But the blood-brain barrier was a barrier to our ability to get any sort of chemical. And we really didn't have that many drugs at that point that could really help us with that. We didn't have the chemistry to get past it. Now, certain things could get past the blood-brain barrier. There are basically two ways to easily get something in. One way is if it mimics something that's already, if a drug mimics something that's already in the brain, then the brain thinks, oh, this is okay. We can let this guy in. He looks like one of us. So opiate-type drugs mimic some of the natural endorphins in the brain. So we could use opiate drugs could get in fairly easily. Solvents get in fairly easily because the cell membranes of cells are made out of lipids. Anything that will dissolve fats, anything that will work that way can get through the membranes naturally and get in. And so, you know, you've probably heard of people getting high by sniffing glue or solvents or, you know, paint thinner or spray paint, the solvents from spray paints and other things. Yeah, you can get those into the bloodstream and they'll go right through the continuous capillaries. But they'll do a lot of damage in the nervous system as well. So those aren't things that you really want to get in there. But today, because of our advances in chemistry, we're able to manufacture drugs that can fool the blood-brain barrier, and we can get those in. Sometimes we make a molecule, the active molecule is attached to a molecule that's a solvent-like, not a solvent that would damage the system, but that could get through the blood-brain barrier. And we hitchhike the good molecule on the back of an inert solvent-type molecule. Sometimes we're making molecules that mimic things so that they can trick the blood-brain barrier, and the blood-brain barrier will bring those drugs into the central nervous system. So, the blood-brain barrier is something to contend with, and when you understand it, it makes a whole lot more sense. The CNS term here, central nervous system, you'll hear this. That's basically the brain and the spinal cord, right? This is a high security area in the body. You don't get in unless you can pass through security. It's like going to an airport these days. You have to go through security before you can get in. Central nervous system would be a little bit like the green zone in Iraq, if you've heard of that. There's a wall around a certain part of the city where all the government buildings are. Very high security to try and get in there, because you don't want just anybody getting in there. And just, you know, simply saying mental health is a very different game today because we've got drugs that can stabilize a person's brain chemistry, whereas we didn't have that before. You just had to sort of put people away. So we've taken blood through the arteries, we've come through the capillaries now, and so really all that's left is to get the blood back to the heart. And of course, this isn't a very difficult kind of thing. Getting blood back to the heart is just a matter of collecting all that blood and bringing it back to the heart itself. There's no distribution. There's no pressure. It's just collect all that blood and get it back. And so veins are just collecting tubes. The littlest veins are called venules, kind of like arterioles for arteries, venules for veins. These are the littlest ones. The capillaries begin to unite. They make a little bit bigger blood vessel. That blood vessel is a little bit bigger because it unites with some others. And so the veins, as you're coming back toward the heart, are getting bigger and bigger and less numerous because they're joining one another to make bigger and bigger tubes. And so basically we just say there's venules and there's veins here. When the small veins are in the tissues support them. As soon as a vein passes out of a tissue and into a space in the human body, then it's got to have a layer of connective tissue over it to maintain its strength. Veins don't need smooth muscle, okay, because smooth muscle would collapse the vein or open the vein. We don't need veins to collapse. We need the blood to get back to the heart. We don't need to control that. Now, there sometimes is a little bit of tunica media on the very largest veins. We don't need elastic tissue because we don't want to put any back pressure on this. There's very little pressure in the veins in the first place. So the tunica media is very, very limited in veins. It's basically just the endothelium, and when the blood vessel comes out of a tissue, it's got to have an outer layer of tunica externa to give it some strength so that it doesn't break in the tissues of the body. So we've made a complete circle. We've followed blood from the heart, elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillary beds, 3 different types of capillary beds, depending upon the need, and then veins conducting blood back to the heart. Now, the last thing that I want us to look at here is to answer a question that some people think. I don't know if everybody's concerned about this, but I think it's an interesting question, and the structure of veins helps us answer this. How does blood get back to my heart, being that there's very little pressure in the veins? How does the blood return to the heart? There we go. How does blood return to the heart? Here's a diagram that shows you the pressure changes in the blood vessels as we go from the heart back to the heart. Okay, this is systemic blood flow. So the x-axis down here, the graph, this is what's the pressure in the aorta, what's the pressure in the arteries, in the arterioles, what's the pressure in the capillaries. So we're following from the aorta right back to the vena cava and back to the heart. Here's a measure of pressure. Okay, these are the pressure measures. So you can go to any one of these and look up and see what the pressure is in that part of the system. So you see the line is a wavy line, isn't it? Because there's a cycle to the heart doing its thing. It contracts, and then it relaxes, and then it contracts. It pumps some blood, then it fills with blood. Then it pumps the blood, then it fills with blood. So while it's filling, there's nothing going on. So you see the pressure go up when it's pumping, and then it begins to fall. And it would keep falling if the heart didn't pump again, right? But it's pump, 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 right? And so pressure kind of fluctuates between these two vessels, these two layers, these two numbers. So when somebody takes a blood pressure, right, they always say, oh, you got 120 over 80 or 110 over 70 or 150 over 100, right? And they're measuring these two extremes of the heart pumping and the heart relaxing. So you can see in the aorta, the elasticity of the arteries is helping to keep pressure up. But as we get farther and farther out, right, pressure begins to fall. We're trying to squeeze the blood through smaller and smaller tubes, right? And the muscular arteries are going to have some effect on this. But when we finally get out to the capillaries, look at what we've got. We've only got about 20 units of pressure now, Now that isn't zero. There's still pressure pushing the blood through the capillaries. When we get out of the capillaries, right, we're now below 10. And as we move into the veins, as the veins get bigger and bigger and bigger, there's less and less pressure. And so by the time we try and get back to the heart, there's literally no pressure, at least not from the heart, not from the standard blood pressure. How does the blood get back to the heart with almost no pressure? That's the question. How do I get blood returning to the heart? If I'm thinking, if you think of your heart, 60, 70, 80 beats per minute, bum, 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 more than once per second, the blood's racing out, isn't it? How does that blood get back to the heart with almost no pressure? And the answer is in the structure of the system, and basically one of the most important elements, the structure of the veins themselves. Now we talked about veins being flexible. Remember the very first picture I showed you where the artery was big and solid and the vein was a little more collapsed? Veins are built that way because they've only got basically a tunica interna and a tunica externa. They don't have all the tunica media to give them this extra solid strength. They're very, very flabby. They're very bag-like. They're very, very flexible. And pressure is created by the movement of your skeletal muscles. Have you noticed that when we've had to name arteries and veins, that there's typically one set of arteries but two sets of veins? There's the deep veins and the superficial veins. You've got a whole set of veins here between your skin and your muscle. Every time you move, you squeeze these flabby, baggy veins. They're easily squeezed. So just the movement of my body helps to move blood through the veins. This is why you can't sit still for very long. Right? You can't sit in one position and not move a muscle for very long, or stand and not move a muscle. Anytime somebody stands in a position where they're trying not to move at all, they can get into trouble. Right? Have you ever seen some of the videos of people in weddings, where the best man or somebody just all of a sudden, just keels over? Right? They're not moving at all. So the heart's pumping blood out, but all that blood is going out into the veins and it's not getting back into the heart. And when you run out of blood to pump up to the brain, then the brain just goes out and the person is gone. Right? And it comes on very quickly. Maybe you're getting a little lightheaded and you go, what's happening? And then boom, all of a sudden you're out. So it takes movement. People that have to stand for very long are usually coached in how to move their muscles without being seen. Contract muscles in your arm, contract muscles in your legs. Don't move them, but just, in sort of an isometric way, just contract things. The palace guards and people in marching bands that have to stand for very long. You got to find ways to kind of move things without being seen so you can kind of keep some pressure on the veins and keep blood moving. Now, just squeezing a vein doesn't seem like it would do very much, because if I squeeze it, some of the blood is going to squeeze one way, but some of the blood's going to squeeze the other way. So there's a second thing about veins that helps. Veins have in them valves. Veins have in them little valves. And basically what a valve does is it lets fluid move through it one direction, but it does not allow fluid to move through it the opposite direction. It makes a one-way flow. Now, I don't know if this is too small that you can't see it, but if you look, there's a little valve right here and a little valve right here. And basically what they are a couple of little pockets like this. If this was the walls of the blood vessel, they look like this. They're little pockets. And so if blood is pushing this way, it can go right through. But if blood is pushed back this way, it collects in the pockets And guess what happens to those pockets as they fill? They get bigger, they get swollen, don't they? And as they swell towards the middle, at some point they swell against each other and they shut the opening. Right? And so blood can't back up. So if the valves are pointing up toward the heart, when you squeeze here, the blood coming back closes this valve, and so all the blood here under pressure has to go up, and this valve opens. And so, yeah, you're squeezing on the blood, but the blood is always moving one direction. It can never back up. There's no retreat. So the valves help keep things moving. If the valves ever break down, then circulation gets into trouble. And there is a condition, you see this usually often in leg veins, right, where the valves break down, blood flow stagnates in that area. The veins often swell because the blood isn't still moving. More blood comes in, but it's not moving out because the valves aren't keeping it moving. What do we call those? Yeah. Varicose veins. Varicose veins are veins where the valves are not functioning, and so blood is stagnating. The veins often swell. The swelling creates some pain. You also have a traffic jam sort of situation. Because blood is not moving out, blood can't move in. The arteries that are leading to these veins, right, can't let adequate amounts of oxygenated blood into the area because there's no way out. It's like a traffic jam. So, and sometimes this is hereditary, and sometimes it's just if you put other back pressures on the system, sometimes you can damage the valves. So the valves and the real baggy, flexible nature of the vein allows the skeletal muscles to put pressure on the veins and keep blood moving. So those two elements are really, really very important structural things in keeping the blood going. But if you're like me, that didn't satisfy. Because I'm thinking the heart is going ba-dum, 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 and pumping all of this blood out. And then I'm thinking all that blood goes out, and now the movement of my body is getting the blood back. Well, I'm not sitting here dancing all the time. I am not so active that I could be matching the activity of the heart. How can the blood be coming back? Well, my problem was I was thinking 50% of the blood was in the arteries and 50% of the blood was in the veins. So if it's going out 50% here, it's got to be coming back the same way here. And that's where my thinking was wrong. Here is a chart that shows you where the blood is in the tubes at any one moment in time. Okay? The 20% right here is the heart and the lungs. 20% of all the blood in your human body, if you were to just stop everything at one moment and say, how much blood is here, how much blood is there, at any moment in time, 20% of all your blood is somewhere between your heart and your lungs, filling all of the pulmonary arteries, veins, and capillaries, filling the chambers of the heart. Heart and the lungs have about 20% of the blood. And here's where it gets interesting. Only 15% of the blood is in the arteries, the systemic arteries. This is all pulmonary up here. Systemic arteries only have a very small portion of the blood in them. The capillaries, you've got miles and miles and miles of capillaries in your human body, but only 5% of the total blood is there because the capillaries are so microscopically small. You've got thousands of miles of capillary in your human body, but they're so small, only 5% of the blood is there. But how much blood is in the venous system? 60%. We call this a reservoir. The veins in your human body are like a giant reservoir of blood. Now it begins to make sense to me. Now I'm starting to figure this out. Let me compare the amount of blood in my arteries to the amount of blood in my veins. What is the differential here? How much more blood here than here? Yeah, 4 times, right? 4 times 15 is 60. I've got 4 times as much blood in my veins as I've got in my arteries. Now, do you see it? How much slower can the blood come back to my heart? If I've got 4 times as much blood, it can come back 4 times as slow, right? It can come back. It can be traveling much slower under a lot less pressure and still get back in the same amount that it's going out in. You see that? I've got one system where the blood is traveling very fast, high pressure, but it's just small quantities. I got another system where it's traveling low pressure, but in huge quantities. I think of this like rivers, right? Think of like a river rafting river where the river is very narrow, but the water is going very fast. It gives you a wild ride, right? Or think of something like maybe the Mississippi River where it's huge, but it's just very calm and it's going very slow. They call it Old Man River, right? Both these rivers could be moving the same amount of water. If you stood at a point and measured how much water went by, this is bigger, but it's traveling much more slowly. So if I'm measuring the water, I could come up with the same amount as a river that's more narrow, but it's moving very fast. The blood volume in your body is unequally distributed. Most of the blood is in the veins. This is why it's, besides the pressure, it's not too tough to take blood. If you're going to give blood tests or donate blood, you take it out of the veins because there's so much there in the reservoir, you don't miss as much. So this whole idea of the unequal distribution really helps you understand how and why blood gets back in the same quantities it's going out with. The final thing to say is that breathing actually assists the return of blood to the heart. When I take a breath, when I breathe in, like that, what I'm actually doing is opening up my thoracic cavity like a bellows. The pressure falls as I make it bigger, and the air, the higher pressure in the atmosphere, pushes its way in. Same thing is happening in my cardiovascular system. When I release the pressure, when I lower the pressure in my thoracic cavity, blood is drawn from the veins closer to the heart too. So the same way I'm sucking in air, I'm literally sucking in blood too. The thoracic cavity, it's not a mistake that my heart and lungs are right there next to each other. The action of breathing, the action of my lungs is going to help to draw blood towards it. The lower pressure there is going to mean that I can breathe better.